have Daesung to read the names of the places, the targets. Each target was the same, or the load, the bomb load, the payload was 40 500-pound bombs. And so Daesung, would you come up and read that, and I'll move so you can sit here.
For those of you that aren't familiar with aircraft types, the B-29 was the bomber that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in World War II it was the latest and greatest of the airplanes in the bombing fleet. Flew out of the Mariana Islands, and the airplane had such an advanced fire control system and range and so forth that it was also employed in Korea. And so by the time Korea rolled around, the B-29s were kind of our frontline bomber. And what Daesung is going to read to you is
name the target.
Affiliated with his friend's B-29 missions over Korea. As you saw in the museum yesterday, you saw some of the B-29s on the diorama fly in and destroy the railroad bridges coming into Seoul, which is quite dramatic. So that's what this is all about.
Alright, so all these places the bomb has been dropped. It's about 34 places, and I'll read from first. Okay, Hamhona, that was the first place. Chuncheon, where we have been, and Seolwon, Suncheon, Gyeongnam, and Singnam-ri, and Opari, the last place. So all those places, total 33 places were bombed.
Thank you, Daesung. I knew I couldn't pronounce them, so I want to do thank you very much. And I also want to thank those, all of the ground forces, all the ground forces and the people that are with us today. I had relatives and friends that did the same thing, and so I know it was a very severe situations, and God bless all of you, and thank you so much.
Here we are at the new $33 million First Battle Memorial Hall, which opened in Osan, just 20 miles south of Seoul, this past April.
Here in the town where the first battles were fought by the American troops from Smith Company.
Just by accident, I found my brother-in-law, Edward E. Whalert, and it's pronounced, we always pronounce it Whaler instead of Wollet, or Wollert, and anyway, he married to my older sister.
When you get ready to plan a patrol, you had to find some terrain in your. Didn't look like what you wanted to put the guys on at night out there. You know, they practiced one day, the next day they go out at night and go out on the field in the no man's land and set up patrol and ambush or listening patrol or whatever you told them to do, they'd go out and do it. And that was usually from 20 to 40 people going out from. Yeah. Then when I'd stay awake while they were out because I wanted to find out what was going on and monitor the patrol. When he came back in, if there was any action at all, if they heard, smelt, or anything activity, they'd report that. I was there to monitor and listen to that, report that to the commander the next day, and I'd try to get 2 or 3 hours sleep, and I'd go take the next patrol out and practice with them. So it was almost sleepless as far as sitting down and getting a 6-hour sleep or a 7-hour, 8-hour nap was unheard of.
This amazing diorama gives an aerial view of America's first encounter in the war, as our soldiers hastily arrived from Japan in Task Force Smith and were trucked in from the left to this area near Osan, about 20 miles south of Seoul, and took up positions in the hills as shown. Early in the morning, the heavy T-34 Russian tanks began arriving from the right, followed by massive North Korean forces in yellow. Although our troops tried to slow the onslaught, their ineffective 105mm mortars and rifles couldn't stop the oncoming tanks and enemy troops. Actually, we had a mere 540 U.S. troops to defend against 5,000 North Korean troops plus 34 of the awesome Russian T-34 tanks. The losses were heavy on both sides. Later, more help arrived from the U.S. and from 21 United Nations, and we were able to hold on at the very south of the peninsula at the Pusan perimeter. Then MacArthur's daring sweep up the China Sea and the surprise invasion at Incheon turned the tide of the war. Now, 60 years later, with fine roads and prosperity, this is a thriving area, as spectacularly shown in the diorama.
Beautifully done. Wow.
Well, that's quite an impressive showing, you know.
Were delayed over and over, leading to the extension of war. Countless casualties. 60 years ago, at a time where level democracy in the name of Korea was on the verge of being destroyed, the help of UN allied forces, who came to a land they never knew, and became a light of hope that shines in the darkness of despair.
And now,
That is good. This is a Russian armed carrier, could carry up to 9 men and personnel at up to 60 miles an hour with full 4-wheel drive, and it is amphibious, so it can float across any stream or lake or river as well as continue down the highway. Anti-aircraft unit, so you can see it's got 4 barrels there that can pump away at the low-flying aircraft. This is an American 90mm cannon, which has a range of 11,000 meters, which would be about 6 miles. It's for anti-tank and anti-aircraft that are high-flying. It could only get off around about every 3 seconds. Consequently, it was not fast enough for low-flying aircraft to hit them, but it was fine for higher altitude aircraft. This is the Patton, the last Patton tank that was built, named for General Patton, and Of course, this was a U.S. tank, which was actually more powerful than the T-42s, but the Koreans had none of these in the south, while the North Koreans had 240 T-42s at the beginning of the invasion.
Well, I'm really honored to be in this group of veterans, and I want to say at the outset that the real heroes that are in this car are all the other fellas you've heard, because I never faced enemy fire. I was one of the fortunate ones who've never faced the enemy as they have. So they are the true heroes. But I was honored to be able to be part of the armed forces. Well, something happened over here in the west end of the Pacific, and President Truman declared, we're going to call up all our reservists. And I had become a Naval Air Reservist out at Buckley Naval Airfield. What that meant during school was that one weekend out of every month, I had to go that entire weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and spend it there on the Naval Air Station, working at the trade that I was trained for. So I'm kind of like you guys. I was able to get out without any debt from school, and that was a wonderful advantage to anybody. But in June, the end of June in 1950, well, after I'd been there the second year and just finished my second year at Boulder, our unit got a call. 5 days later, right there in the middle of, actually it was in July 15th, I found myself in San Diego Naval Air Station and ready to go wherever I was ordered from there. I was then ordered back to San Francisco Treasure Island Naval Station, which is right out in the middle of the bay between San Francisco and Oakland. As you probably know if you've been there, there's a huge bridge that stops on Treasure Island on the way over and then hops on to Oakland. Treasure Island had been the seat of the World's Fair some years back, and it was an artificial island, perfect rectangle, and it had been built up from dredged the mud and so forth from the bottom of the bay, and was quite an interesting island. And after it had been in the World's Fair, and they had those beautiful buildings of all nations, they tore all those down, and it became a Naval Air Station. They built a Naval Air Station, which is essentially a city right there on that island. So I was sent there, and then after a few days, I got my orders to deploy to Pearl Harbor, out in the middle of the Pacific. And they assigned me to a flight which was on one of the largest planes ever built. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was called the Mars Flying Boat.
A new giant joins the Navy's Sky Fleet, the 72-ton Mars Flying Boat service. It has a 200-foot wingspan and is 120 feet long. Powered with 4 motors totaling more than 8,000 horsepower, the big boat has a speed in excess of 200 miles an hour and can carry payloads of 30,000 pounds or more. Our Navy adds giant wings to the growing cloud over Japan.
Skipping down San Francisco Bay over those little waves out there, it's really something to get it off ground because it is hugely heavy. There were a lot of us in it that were being transferred to Hawaii. It was a troop carrier from that time. And about 14 hours later, we were in Pearl Harbor and landed there. And I immediately deployed there around Pearl Harbor to the west side of Oahu. That was an interesting morning as you passed all the cane fields, the sugar cane fields, the pineapple fields, and all of Hawaii, a beautiful country, and went to my first assignment. So I was there then for essentially 2 years until 1952. And during those 2 years, what our duty was to train the night pilots that were going to be on the carriers going off of the shore of Korea. And so the pilots of the aircraft, both propeller and jet at that time, because the Navy still had some of the propeller aircraft, which were great for low altitude and those missions, and then the jets, which were greater for the high altitude, fast moving missions. So we were training pilots on those so they could operate at night. Not many of them back at Pensacola in basic training had the emphasis on night flying that they needed in Korea, because as you remember, most of the movements in Korea were at night by the Chinese. They couldn't move in the daytime because our Air Force boys could spot them. So they started doing all their moving at night. And that's why we needed pilots that were well trained to use their radar and their infrared so they could see down there what was going on. And that was our duty at Barbers Point Naval Air Station, was to train our Navy pilots, and not just ours, but other United Nations pilots came in for training too, the British and all, because none of them had been trained for that kind of night duty. And while there, the Princeton, I believe Rod mentioned this morning, the Princeton was one of those 3 aircraft carriers that gave them such excellent air support during the Korean War, and from offshore, and the Princeton came through, and so I was selected to be on an inspection crew to make sure they were operationally ready to go to Korea. And this, we saw the naval operations, and a lot of the pilots that we'd been training then were sent there. They flew on board to the Princeton as it maneuvered around the Hawaiian waters out there. And they got a chance to practice on the real thing, the bouncing carrier deck of that floating city, which it really is, and be experienced in actual conditions. Of course, at the Barbers Point Naval Air Station, we had 2-mile long runways, which was a lot different than they were going to have when they went over there. So we were evaluating their performance, seeing if they were really ready, giving them experience. And I had a chance while on that inspection tour, while we were inspecting them to evaluate them, to make a documentary film on carrier operations. And it shows the extreme difficulty under which those pilots and the whole crew on the shipboards were under to keep those planes flying and to get them off the ship through those catapults that catapulted them to flying speed within a couple of seconds, and then to be able to land on that little floating deck, which was kind of like this bus. It was just floating on the sea, and they had to be able to come back and land on that postage stamp in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It really took some great finesse and great skill. And so this documentary was to show to all viewers what was really involved in getting those missions off and getting them returned safely to their ship. So by the way, I have a copy of that documentary, which I'll be glad to show. If any of you are interested, we can show it on big screen, either at the motel or hotel or whatever, if there's an opportunity to. And it's about 20 minutes long. But it will give you some idea of what we're involved in those carrier operations. And so you can see that even though we guys in the Navy usually had a clean place to eat and to sleep, unlike the poor souls out there in those foxholes and in the cold, but it was still a very dangerous mission and a very necessary one, because we were able to provide that air cover that was so essential. So after those 2 years were up, we didn't know at that time how long we were going to be in, but it turned out this was before the final armistice was signed, but it was after the 38th parallel was once again the demarcation between North and South Korea by July of 1952. There was still more shooting while both sides maneuvered to try to gain an advantage at the armistice table. So there was some bad, like Heartbreak Ridge, some really bad situations. The war continued. But for some reason, a number of us who had been reservists, they said our job was done. We could go back home and be released from active duty. So I was glad to return home, continue college for the next 2 years, and finish it. And so by then, I graduated in 1954, and went out into the world of technology with General Electric on helping develop the transistor, which when I was in school, there was no transistor. So the electronics that I studied was really ancient history now, because that was back in the 50s up through the war. But during World War II and the Korean War, there were great developments on reducing the size of the tubes. During World War II, we had big glass tubes with filaments in there that were real hot, took a lot of power to utilize them, and slowly during the war they developed smaller and smaller tubes, glass tubes with a filament, but they had a triode situation where they could amplify, and that was the secret to electronics. And they developed them smaller and smaller, but they still took quite a bit of power, and they were fragile with glass. And so when I graduated, that's as far as electronics had come. And during the next few years, my first years with General Electric, I helped develop the little solid-state transistor. At that time, it was a little piece about that big. It looked like a small top hat, a little black thing. Had 3 wires coming out of it, and you just soldered those into your circuit board. And instead of that fragile, high wasting of energy tube in there, you had something that was not hot. It didn't waste electricity. It was very efficient to run, and you could put hundreds of those in the space of 4 or 5 tubes. So printed circuits then were developed for these transistors, and I helped write the first transistor handbook in America, the one that told people how to utilize these little transistors for their own work and own experiments, and development of little tiny radios and little tiny equipment for the armed forces that they could carry on the planes now that were very light. So you reduce the size of the equipment down 100 times, from great big boxes with tubes to tiny little boxes, kind of like our cell phones now. And so that was exciting to be able to be in on that revolution, and that's changed everything. The transistor and the printed circuit that then came after the development of the transistor, which then can put layers and layers of solid-state semiconductors, and you can put actually hundreds of thousands of transistors on that little chip that is at the heart of your cell phone. So anyway, that's been my experience. I went on from General Electric to IBM, and I sold computers for IBM. This is where I used my business training in sales electronics, and we were selling $2 million computers that would fill this bus, and all they could do was print out a payroll, numbers and names, letters. They couldn't do any pictures. They couldn't do anything to graphics, whatever. All they could print was letters and numbers, and they would spit them out by the huge quantities of them very fast. That would tell how much pay each person got and how much was taxes and all this. And actually, those were $2 million. And now that little cell phone you're carrying in your pocket will run circles around that $2 million computer that I was selling with IBM. And you pay maybe $100 or even get one free, as long as you commit to 2 years of use. So that is truly exciting to have been through all these revolutions, which have completely changed the whole world. Our communications is nowhere. You can't recognize any of it now compared to what it was then. The GPS, navigation, I mean, it just goes on and on. The space program, which then I worked in after IBM, is one that really developed these activities like GPS. And I was fortunate enough, while I was with Martin Marietta Company out of Denver, we were making those huge ICBMs, which put up large satellites. And I was sent to Florida to launch one of those ICBMs with 8 spy camera satellites. And these were placed in orbit, stationary orbit, all around the Earth, so that at all times we could see what was going on all over Russia, all over Europe, all over, everywhere in the world actually, and relay that information back down. So these were our spy eyes. And I had the enjoyment of pushing the button, making sure that was ready to go, and then pushing the button to launch that enormous mission. So that gives a little about my background, gives you a little idea of why I'm so thrilled to be living in this era and to have lived in this century that I have, because I think really it was the beginning of things that are going to be so much greater than anything you've seen yet. You can't imagine another 5 years what's going to be available to all of us, because we're now doing 3D printing, as you may know. We can print out parts for anything, cameras, tanks, anything, with a printer, as long as you have the right program to develop this new item. And so we can customize cars, radios, everything for individual people or for individual missions or uses. And it can be printed and be in your hands within days. It's a whole new world coming along, and you are certainly fortunate to have a chance of being here as it continues to develop, and a lot of you are going to help these developments, I know, and move them along even further than we were able to.
Thank you.
Okay, well thank you. I hope I take too much of your time.
We are going to continue our rolling seminar here, which has gone very well so far. And next up are going to be our flyboys, and they're going to talk about their experiences over here, maybe a little bit about the types of planes that were used in Korea. I know Joe here got to see an old AT-6 in the museum yesterday and stand on the wing and pat it gently, so he saw an old friend, sort of. He did 100 missions in those types of planes. So he's going to be our first speaker, and with that I'll hand the mic over to him and he can tell you his story.
Thank you very much, appreciate that. He pretty well told the history on me. I was fortunate to be in the Air Force. All four branches of the service are very, very important, equally important, and this country is entirely, totally dedicated to the job that the four of them have done, and their cooperation is what's made our country so great. I was stationed somewhere along this road that we are on today at a town, a little airstrip called Pyeongtaek. As Andy mentioned, I spent 100 missions here. It took me about 10 months. I won't go into a lot of detail about that. I had some good ones and some bad ones and some tough ones. Got shot up a few times, but the Lord was taking care of me, and I came out of it all right. Glad to be back in a free country. What I would like to visit about, because my buddy Jeff here, he'll elaborate a little bit more about the Air Force. I'd like to talk about this fantastic college and you wonderful, wonderful students. I'd like to just share a few thoughts. You're in the early prime time of your life, and everything that you are doing, you are entirely responsible for the rest of your life. It dictates your destiny, how you conduct yourself in these very, very formative years of your life. I would ask you every evening as you're preparing to go to bed, we'll say, you're there in the bathroom looking at yourself in the mirror, brushing your teeth and getting ready, and that person that you're looking at is the one that you are responsible for, and is responsible for your ups and downs and what you are going to do with your life. A lot of times we want to blame it on our mother or daddy or the teacher or the boss, whatever, but you dictate the future of your life. Always keep that in mind, the person you're looking at in that mirror. I have a little poem that kind of expresses my opinion on what I'm wanting to tell you. And what I would ask for you to please listen to this poem. I have to live with myself, and so I want to be fit for myself to know. I want to be able, as the days go by, always to look myself straight in the eye. I don't want to keep on a closet shelf a lot of secrets about myself. I don't want to stand with the setting sun and hate myself for the things that I have done. Whatever happens, I want to be self-respecting and conscience-free. I want you to know that God loves everyone on this bus, you students and all of my old buddies here. God loves every one of you, and I do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I'm sure that in private conversations on the trip, you might ask Joe about some more details about his missions. He's not he doesn't blow his own horn. He knows what he did. And a lot of veterans are like that. They don't want to brag about what they did. They don't want to make it sound extraordinary, but what they did was extraordinary. So some of you may ask him some questions about his missions. He was hit by enemy fire a number of times, and when you fly 100 missions in the combat zone, you've accomplished something, let me tell you. So he's a man that has decided not to blow his own horn, but some of you may want to ask him some questions somewhere along the way. So we move on to our next esteemed veteran, and Mr. Tremblay is going to talk about his experience over here, and he might talk a little bit about the types of aircraft that were involved in the Korean conflict, which may be fascinating, and I'm sure he has some interesting comments to make about the Korean conflict in his service here that cover a wide area. So we look forward to hearing from him.
Mine was a rather unusual, charmed, very well, I get supervised from on high. I never was quashed as far as my missions are concerned. Anyway, starting in Korea, but it actually started before that. I was commissioned in June of 1950, and my first assignment was with the Lackland Air Force Base training school for the instructors and TIs. I was just a green lieutenant at that time, and they made me the assistant director because of my background in having taught school before I joined the service. But the thing that happened was really quite unexpected. The training base at that time was multiplied by 3 or 4 in a matter of 2 or 3 months. And it was in the winter, getting close to the winter time, and San Antonio is not really all that warm during that time. They had tents in all the parade fields, and many of the kids would come and find anything that looked like wood and start building their own pile. Anyway, training became not 13 weeks anymore, but probably 7 or 8 weeks, and off they went. I spent about 1.5 years doing this, and then I decided I'd like to get in the action, so I applied for flight training. And when it was time for me to solo, my dear instructor said, "I don't think you're going to be a pilot." He says, "I'm making sure that you're going to get into the navigation school. You're better fitted for that." So I did. Went through training and trained to be a short-range navigator, helping with fighter bombers. Well, it so happened that after the crew training, my crew left before I did by about a month, and I was no longer a short-range navigator, but I ended up in Seoul City Air Base, K-16, which is now, I think, part of that major church that we're talking about, Dr. Cho's church. Anyway, at Seoul City Air Base, we flew multiple types of missions, one of which was Psy-War, psychological warfare, dropping leaflets all over North Korea. And we flew C-47s, which is what is the equivalent of the DC-3, or what we refer to as the pregnant C-47, the C-46. And with those, we had sometimes as many as 20 targets that we hit. They didn't shoot at us because they figured probably we were delivering the mail. Telling those folks, you know, get out of there, we're coming in tomorrow with some bombs instead of leaflets. So even though we were flying quite low, leaflets were dropped with little parachutes on them. Eventually it exploded and they spread all over the place. The only bad incident about this was one day we were flying on the west side of Panmunjom, and some of our leaflets ended up right over the Peace Center, the Peace Talk Center. Well, about a week or two later, the commander comes up to us and said, "You guys did a boo-boo." So we got a slap in the hand with a smile on his face. Nothing further went on. Didn't go in our records either. So much about Psy-War. Psy-War also included voice missions in a B-26 that was rigged up with a huge loudspeaker. And flying with us was either a Korean girl or a Chinese girl, sort of a reverse of the Tokyo Rose days. So they usually would be speaking over the front lines for about 45 minutes or so, and then they get a 10-minute break and we go back and do this for about 4 hours or so. I did this quite often, and it was one of the easiest missions. But it so happens that one day a Collier's magazine reporter came with us, and we both sat in the front of that B-26. I don't think you've seen a picture of the B-26. Some of you have. And it's a rather small fighter bomber that was modified. And I sat in front in the bubble with the reporter, and our Korean girl was right next to the pilot speaking to the people on the ground. Anyway, it was quite an experience for him. I have a copy of that article that was published in December 13, 1952. I don't know if you'd ever want to have a copy of this. Anyway, I'll make a copy available for those who want to read about it. The article is not only about my mission, but about psychological warfare in general. So let's go next to the intelligence missions. Intelligence involved dropping agents behind the line as far as beyond the Yalu River, as a matter of fact. And this could be either men or women. And these were rather hairy missions in as much as it had to be pinpoint navigation, making sure that they did indeed drop exactly where they were supposed to. And we had quoted visual messages on the ground, like a triangle or a circle of some sort. And if we could not identify them, they didn't drop. The other part of these missions were resupplying these folks, and again, making sure that the supplies ended up in the right hands. And that was pretty much the extent of my missions like those. Then the last one was combat support in terms of dropping flares that would parachute down and illuminate the combat zone. So I got to know all of these mountains like the fingers of my hand. And again, it was pinpoint navigation. The combat, the commander that was involved in the fighting would call and give us coordinates, and we'd have to come up and make sure that we are dropping those flares precisely where they were needed. One mission that was rather interesting in a way, and I know that this is one where my guardian angels were right on top of us.
We came for a landing, and that particular evening, we didn't drop any flares. So we come back with a full load of flares. As the pilot touches down the runway, the left wheel completely disappears. And we're on our way to clobbering a whole bunch of parked airplanes. Fortunately, we probably had the best pilot around. Got us back in the air, went back to the front lines, dropped all of our flares, anything that was loose in the airplane, and I kept one thing, my 45. I even brought that 45 back home as a memento. And also, one of those parachutes from the flares. I eventually gave them away to the museum. Okay, so I got there in September of '52. I flew 75 missions in probably 2 months. I mean, there were no navigators except about 3 or 4 of us, and we could fly as often as we wanted to. And sometimes I'd fly as many as 2 or 3 missions a day. So by the time we were finished, I was about ready to go home before Christmas. But some of you will probably remember that this is the time where President Eisenhower was campaigning, and one of his campaign messages, I'm going to go to Korea and visit the troops. He did. Well, as a result, they sort of canceled all of the returns for at least, I guess, a month and a half or so. So we were there on standby trying to cover up for where he went, because that was really dangerous for him to be there in a combat zone as a newly elected president. Anyway, the second incident, there were more than that, but the second incident is a unique one. Christmas time, I come back from, not a regular missions, but come back flying, and there's nobody in Quonset hut except another officer who had a bunch of Christmas gifts. The guys in the Quonset had decided to play a trick on him and hid all of his gifts. And all of a sudden, I'm the only one that walks in, and this guy was absolutely infuriated. Reaches back, punches me in the face, breaks my nose. Yeah, that was my combat. That was about the only thing I can say that happened in the combat zone. I didn't get a Purple Heart incident, but it kept me back. I didn't want to go home with Shriners, and especially with a broken nose. So I stayed on for a couple more weeks after that. Anyway, these are my 2 wartime incidents. Subsequently, I ended up traveling pretty much all over the world in an organization called Logistic Support Squadrons. These were involved in doing the most unusual kind of transportation you can think of. We were repositioning nuclear devices wherever treaties had been signed. Could have been anywhere in North Africa, Spain, France, Germany, in Europe, and then some of them were in Japan and Okinawa and places like that. Anyway, because of that, I ended up visiting a whole slew of different countries. The other part of my transportation as a crew member was being stationed in Panama, and my prime job was plans officer. But every time I could, I went on those embassy flights from Panama to Lima to Santiago to Rio de Janeiro. In other words, I was fortunate to visit all of the South American countries. And one of the things we were hopeful or prayed for once in a while is for the engineer to come back and say, your plane is not flying today. Something's wrong with one of the engines. So that gave us a chance to stay more than one day. These were, as far as I'm concerned, very educational in the sense that if you want to know something about the world, travel there. To finish this thing in terms of traveling, I have actually lived in 8 different countries at one time or another, and I guess we visited about close to about 75 or 80 countries and lived in 10 different states. So if you join the Air Force, have a bag ready. And in many cases, you have to be ready to leave in a couple of hours. And when I was flying on those special device missions, I never could tell my wife where I was going. And sometimes we didn't even know where we were going until we got there to flight operations. So this was a rather interesting, probably one of the most interesting times of my career, but also very, very difficult on families. And many of the guys, including myself, eventually the wife says, "Sayonara, I've had enough of this." Anyway, to conclude, I spent time doing what Mr. Keller did for quite a while. I went back to school and became an engineer, and lo and behold, 3 years in France as a communications officer. I speak French fluently, and I'm on the economy most of the time, so I got to enjoy France the best way you can. All expenses paid, not only in the paid, but also making a salary doing it. And the sites we visited were small radio relay stations, usually on top of mountains, and a group of young folks, usually a young sergeant in charge of the site. And my job was to go and visit with them, stir them up, get them out of trouble, visit the people locally, and all that. So it turned out to be probably my best experience in the Air Force. The other experience was, like Mr. Keller did, is going into the missile construction activity. We ended up building missile sites in Arkansas, and I was invited to go to Vandenberg for about a month to work on missile sites here too, and in Buckley, where you were stationed. So these and so many other events in my life makes me so thankful that I probably had at least a dozen or more angels watching over me. Never got any worse than maybe a torn ligament in one leg. Had nothing to do with flying activities. It was one of those things, you know, that you do unexpectedly. And as a result of this trip, I've learned a lot. It seems as if I've aged another 10 years listening to all of these experiences. You guys are very inspirational. But probably the most inspirational thing for me are you young people. I definitely learn more by listening than by talking. I haven't learned anything by saying all of this here. But listening to you guys and you girls, the lovely people, I feel enriched beyond words. And you can be assured that with all the pictures I've been taking, you're going to be my thoughts and my prayers. And you are very special because you are going to a school that really prepares you for what happens next. I had a rather similar experience when I grew up, you know, and got involved in the monastic life, where no distraction, all you do is learn and pray and play. And so in 5 years' time, from 13 and a half to 18 and a half, I was able to complete high school, college, and 1 year spiritual studies, and started teaching at 18 and a half. And that's where I picked up my credentials for teaching both in Lewiston, Maine, eventually in Ohio, and finally in Washington after I retired from the Air Force. Spent 15 years teaching and counseling, and that pretty well covers everything. I see some people already nodding, so it's time for me to quit. Thank you so much for being part of this group, and I wish you the very best.
Well, thank you. Well, I think everyone can agree this has been a delightful and enlightening experience for you to hear these guys talk about their experiences, and I think when you're on trips like this, you're getting massive overloads of information, and sometimes it's hard to remember it all. And I noticed a lot of you are writing blogs and journals, and that's the best way to do it. Is when you hear something extraordinary, make sure you write it down that night, because when you get home, this trip will be one big blur of sights, sounds, information, faces, things you've never seen before, food you've never eaten before, and everything you can do to enhance your memory and your recall of the things you did and where you were and who said what and what this veteran said, and the inspirational words that everybody has been covering you with will enrich your life forever. You guys can't even conceive of being 40 or 50 or 60 one day, but believe me, you'll or 85. Thank you. Even when you reach that age, you'll remember this trip. It'll be an amazing event for you to have traveled with these fellows, and to be able to tell your children and grandchildren that I traveled with Korean War veterans. And you should have known them. They were a feisty, spunky bunch, and they had the most amazing stories you've ever heard. With that, we'll wrap up the seminar on wheels today, and let's give those guys one round of applause here for their participation.
This is the impressive Dubadong War Memorial, which was built in remembrance of the bloody but victorious battles which held this strategic area just 40 miles north of Pusan, the large port city at the southern tip of Korea.
Looks like a Nike missile from the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama.
August of 52, probably through December of 52. At some time or another, we plane guarded for the Princeton, along with the Kearsarge and the Baumhammersarge. And so when you mentioned Princeton, I just wondered when you were on there. So
yeah, was that along the southern coast or the north coast of Korea?
Yeah, north coast of Korea. Korean waters. So
yeah,
we plane guarded them with destroyers. There was
you were protecting them.
Yeah.
Was there more than one carrier at the time besides Princeton?
Yeah, the Kearsarge. And the Baumhammersarge.
They were all three.
They were all three
right there at the same time.
Yeah, and we alternated in plane garden for the carriers, as well as alternating with going in and shore bombarding. Now there was four of us: the Barton, the Soli, and the Strong, and my ship, the Pierce. So we alternated on our jobs that we had to do.
You have a good memory then. You remember it all. Well, all these flags, so some of the United Nations flags, and you see that cell tower in the distance, wouldn't be there today if that war hadn't been fought to the conclusion that it was, keeping South Korea safe and independent. They're just everywhere. This is just a small town out in the country. The size of these apartment buildings and condos where everybody lives. Nobody has a single family home around here. It's been 4 years. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I don't know what I'll do after.
Ashley's, the Korean equivalent of our Golden Corral buffet restaurant.
will be.
Actually, I'm from school.
We travel past some of the leading docks at one of the world's largest container shipping ports in the world. Busan's docks can take care of 169 vessels at one time, and this huge ship alone can transport over 13,000 automobile-sized containers. We arrive at the unique United Nations Cemetery, the only UN cemetery in the world, where a little over 2,000 of the fallen service people who came here from many nations are now buried. Actually, over 40,000 UN forces died in Korea, including 36,000 from the US, but the rest have been repatriated and reburied in their own homelands.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
There are only 36 Americans still buried here, of the 36,000 who died here.
For those that just got in this area, if you see a triangle, it means that they are buried here. If you see a dot behind the name, that means the body has either been repatriated or they're MIA.
This wall of remembrance is similar to the wall of names we visited Wednesday in Seoul, but it's even more similar to the outdoor Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C., which honors the 58,000 U.S. forces who died in that war in the late 50s through the mid-70s.
And it goes a long way. And they're all back in the USA now. Not buried here, but memorialized here. Continued around, my goodness. Wall still continues down, down, down. Well, finally we come to the end here. Views from Wyoming.
our flight uniform here after the communists came in. Things of course started changing dramatically, and they sewed a little deal right here on our right shoulder and on our left knee, and it had a cyanide pill in it. And our instructions were that should we get shot down, if it's the Chinese communists, give them your name, rank, and serial number, and they'll treat you as a prisoner of war as you're supposed to be, as a standard world procedure. If the North Koreans get you, take the pill. Don't take a chance, take the pill.
Do the Tell-America programs with them. We put on flag education programs for them. And if you've ever seen a couple of hundred squirmy little grammar school kids sitting on the floor of a gymnasium while you're explaining the history of the U.S. flag, of which there have been 19 different ones, and ask them questions, and we make fun of their teachers, and they get a big giggle out of that. But they're quiet, and they listen. Hard to believe, you know. First one I did, I thought, well, this is going to be a mess. But they sit there on their haunches, and then when we asked questions and got involved in the history of the flag, it was amazing what they knew. I was surprised. When you go up in age, they get less attentive. You know, they're not really interested anymore, especially high school. So we quit going to high school and doing the Tell-America programs. But Hollister actually honored all the veterans in the area three times around Veterans Day and some Memorial Day with lunch. And all the kids made a card out personally. You know, really nice. Yeah, I've still got them. That's great. And nobody else in that area that I know of has done as much as Hollister. Super.
And I thought it would give you guys kind of a focal point here this morning if I read to you the letters that were sent to my mother after Dad was killed. Dad was killed on the same day my little brother was born, March 11th, 1953. And if any one of these guys had been killed, this is the kind of letter that their family would have received at home. This happens to be from General Mark Clark. At the time, he was the commander over here in 1953. This is from Headquarters, United Nations Command, Office of the Commander-in-Chief. Dear Mrs. Giles, the untimely death of your husband, Tech Sergeant Hume Giles, has been a tragic loss. While no one can fully share the sorrow which the death of a loved one brings, he will sorely be missed by his comrades. We earnestly hope that you may find some comfort in the knowledge of the understanding sympathy of those who knew him and shared service with him in this command. There should also be some measure of consolation in knowing that he met death pridefully and manfully in the service of his country. I have faith that his devotion to duty in defense of all that we and the free peoples of the world hold most dear has helped us on the long, hard road by which alone we may expect someday to reach a just and honorable and enduring peace. May God grant we continue to follow that road, whatever be the sacrifices entailed. With deepest and sincere sympathy, I am respectfully General Mark Clark, General U.S. Army. So that would have been what any one of these veterans over here, if you'd been killed in action, that would have been what his family received. The only thing I'd like to add to that is that I remember, I was 4 years old, I remember when they shipped Dad's body home to West Virginia, and he was in a casket and he had been riddled with shrapnel, and of course they couldn't even open the casket for viewing, so it was a closed viewing and I wasn't allowed to go. And the day he was buried, the Marine Corps did send a detail of 4 Marines who were there all week long with the family. And I remember those guys talking to me and telling me what a wonderful and dedicated person Dad was and so forth. And I remember the day he was buried. It was a beautiful sunny day, much like today. And there were flowers. The Marine Corps did a 4-gun salute, and it was all very impressive. They looked resplendent in their uniforms. So it was sort of grand and festive, and at the same time very tragic for me. And I can still remember it like it was yesterday. And then they lowered his casket into the ground, and he was in the earth, and his soul gone to heaven. And I've been back to visit his grave many times and put flowers there. But I just wanted to read this so you would have some idea of the gravity of what was still going over here in March 1953, and what any one of these guys' families would have experienced had they been killed over here. And it's wonderful that they all came home. So as we go up to Panama and John today, we'll be passing within about 4.5 miles of where Dad was killed. And when I came over here with my mother about 10 years ago, we actually went up to the site, and the Marine Corps took us up there and were very helpful showing us where it was. Today it's just a floodplain because the river has risen so many times and flooded it, covered up the area of where he was. So you'll have a very interesting day, and it'll be especially meaningful for me. So, and also it's been wonderful traveling with you and sort of having little mini seminars with all of you who have been asking questions, and very eager to learn all the facts and figures and so forth about the campaign. And you guys are so lucky to have an experience like this. It's a wonderful experience, and I'm sure you guys all realize that. And especially the veterans. It's been amazing to be with them and talk with them. And the pages of history books are one thing, but the veterans are kind of alive and talking history books. So my hat's off to them. It's great being with you guys. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, how y'all doing today? Oh, I get a microphone. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, how y'all doing today?
Great, thank you.
I'm Mr. Price. I am the Garrison Anti-Terrorism Force Protection Officer, okay? So, welcome to Camp Humphreys. I said y'all because I'm from the great state of North Carolina. Y'all ever been there? We got any Tar Heels in the house? No? Any Duke fans will not be allowed to come into the installation, okay? So if you're a Duke fan, you might as well just get off the bus now.
How about Texas?
Okay.
Texas.
Was anyone ever stationed here in Camp Humphreys before? No? Well, it has definitely changed. We went from, right now the base is 1,855 square acres, and they're adding another 2,177 acres to make it around 5,300 square acres. So it's a big project that we've had here. We've been working on it for I just retired from Seoul in the Army. I did 23 years in the Army, military police. No, you know, don't throw me off the bus just yet. But they'll be able to take you around the base, and they're going to show you some of the things, and super gym and all that kind of stuff. So you guys will get definitely the 50 cent tour. Okay.
A question: is this Army only, or?
No, sir. Mainly it's Army, but we do have some Air Force here. Sometimes the Marines are here. So if there are any Marines, they very seldom come up. We have Air Force, Army, but that's and not very much Navy. I mean, one or two Navy individuals, but we're growing. We're anticipating this year. Not a lot of the units are coming down from Seoul. Next year, in 2015, more units will start moving down from the DMZ.
My name is Ed Johnson. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for the Garrison. I have the unenviable position of being the only thing between you and Chow on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. So we'll try to make this as brief as possible. But I wanted to show you just a few things about our Garrison, what we're doing here at Camp Humphreys, and show you what the future holds for the Army in Korea. And then answer any questions you might have.
And if I can, hey guys, it was great to meet you guys, okay?
Oh, fine.
I hope you guys
Good
have a
job.
great tour in Korea. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. We do very much appreciate it. But I got to run, go do something else. So you have a great time here in Korea. Oh?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Be good to yourself.
Now, interestingly, you see a lot of civilians in here. Most of the civilians are prior military service. And in fact, every one of the civilians in this room right now are prior military. And some of us are in a unique position where, in the time of war, we take our suit off and we put our uniform back on. And so, I think you are. Yes. I am here. all the civilians in the room also in time of war would stay here, our families would leave, and we would switch into uniform now. So I'd like to thank the veterans sincerely for taking time to visit us here. It's a real honor for us to have you in our midst. This is the first time I've been here for many years. This is the first time we've had a group of Korean veterans come through as a group to visit us, so thank you. Excuse me, I need to work over here. Oh yeah, please come on in. Let's slide this over. Nobody wants to be the commander. Okay, I'll do unilaterally. That's no longer the commander's chair.
Go ahead. Here comes the commander. Right?
Yeah, come on in.
Go ahead.
In the Army, we have a saying, when in charge, take charge. And if you're not in charge, the person in charge will let you know. So to give you an idea of where we've changed, I want to show you what Camp Humphreys looked like during the Korean War. I have some old pictures. It was basically red clay, and it was an airfield. Here's another one. And looked like that. Okay. And it wasn't really a U.S. airfield. This airfield here was built by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1919. For those of you, I don't know how much they've told you about Korean history, but Korea was occupied by the Japanese for many years in the early 20th century. And then following World War II, Korea was liberated, and then with the onset of the conflict with North Korea, these old airfields and some of the old Japanese installations were turned into U.S. military installations. And this particular airfield was called K6, and it was home to a Marine Corps air wing that flew out of here. And then following the Korean War, it kept the name K6, and in fact, if you get into a taxi cab right now, and you told them, take me to Camp Humphreys, you might get here and you might not. But if you told them, take me to K6, the Koreans all know what that means, and that would get you here. Okay.
And so the flag comes down Friday at Camp Humphrey, the largest American base in Asia, where there is still much tension caused by the militant North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. So next we will visit another secret tunnel built by the North Koreans for a surprise attack, and see the Bridge of No Return, as well as enter the heavily fortified DMZ, Demilitarized Zone. In the evening, a fabulous fireworks show on the wide Han River, seen with 1 million others. Finally, Sunday, we visit to the beautiful Chosan Palace grounds and attend an afternoon worship service at the Omnuri Church, followed by our last sumptuous supper in Korea, and then the long flight home.